Hello everyone and welcome to the most important tournament there is and ever was. It is of course the Candidates Tournament, and we are back in Yekaterinburg with the second half of the Candidates Tournament. The first half finished last year, and then due to the situation in the world we had to postpone the tournament indefinitely, and now it is finally being continued. So 7 rounds have been played. We're gonna see 7 more rounds, and if you don't remember, this is where we left it off. So the leaders when we left it off last year in March were Maxime, Vachier, Lagrave and Jan Nepomniachtchi, who had shared first place with 4.5 out of 7 points, followed by with 3.5 points Fabiano, Caruana, Anish Giri and Van Hau and Alexander Grishuk. And with 2.5 points, Ding Liren and Kirill Alexeyenko, the new guy amongst the big guys. So here, Fabi versus Maxime, Vachier, Lagrave is the first game that we are going to show from the second half of the Candidates Tournament, and it is a really wild one. It is you will suffer while watching this game, I guarantee you that. So best just dive straight into it. And for those of you who don't remember, the Candidates Tournament is being played with 100 minutes for the first 40 moves. Then we have 50 minutes for the next 20 moves, and then 15 minutes to the end of the game with a 30 seconds increment starting from move 1. So the games can take quite a while, and this one most certainly did. So once again, let's check it out. Fabi with the white pieces opens with e4, and everyone was wondering, with Maxime having so long to prepare, will he stick to his Sicilian defense, or will he try something else against e4? And of course, Maxime goes for c5. He plays the Sicilian defense as he always does. We have knight to f3 by Fabi, d6, and now d4. Striking in the center, we have captures, and now knight to f6. We have knight to c3, and of course a6. Maxime goes for the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian. We have bishop to g5, and now e6, preparing to play bishop to e7, castle, and so on. And here we have f4 by Fabi. Asking Maxime, how do you want to continue? With the usual bishop to e7, or do you want to go pawn grabbing as you, pretty much always do? And Maxime continues with queen to b6. He says, I'm very much interested in your b2 pawn, and I don't mind being up material, even if it costs me some development in the opening. Fabi says, alright, go on, a queen to d2, have that b2 pawn, and here queen captures on b2, and this is all very standard theory, there's nothing new about this. We have rook to b1, attacking the queen, queen to a3, and now, of course, striking in the center with e5. So the knight is under attack, and also you are putting some pressure on d6. So here, while you could go for d captures on e5, Maxime goes for h6 first. We have bishop to h4, and only now d captures on e5. Even though g5 here is a possibility, but it's a very tricky line. For example, captures, or rather not that, captures on g5 first, and after h captures, bishop captures. Now we're going to move the knight, and after, for example, bishop to f4, you can't really say that black has, all that much compensation for this, not really. So while it can be played, maybe not for such a serious game as one being played in the Candidates Tournament. So instead, d captures on e5, f captures on e5, and now knight f to d7, even though now g5 is a perfectly viable option. So knight f to d7, and now comes knight to e4. So Fabi getting his pieces closer to the black king, and it's very easy to go wrong here, and many people have gone wrong here. For example, if you just continue development, let's say knight to c6, you put pressure on white's d4 knight, simply knight captures, b captures, and now bishop to e2, and you have a lot of problems here. Just to show you that it's extremely difficult for black to develop here. Let's say you try bishop c5, a very natural developing move. You prevent the white king from castling. Rook to b3. You push the black queen back, and after, let's say, queen captures on a2, now you run into knight captures, and you're just lost here. Because if you capture back, then queen to d8 is checkmate. So this is only some of the things that can go wrong. But of course, Maxime knows the absolute strongest idea here, and that is queen captures on a2, and now the rook on b1 is under attack. So rook to d1, and now queen back to d5. And here Maxime says, alright, I've grabbed some material, I now have a passed a pawn, and look at this, rook behind the passed pawn. If I can get this passed pawn rolling down the board, you will be in a lot of trouble. But I first have to, survive not being checkmated. So queen to e3, And now Fabi asks, all right, your queen is now nicely aligned with my rook. If I move my knight, let's say some knight to whoa, sorry about that, some knight to f5 action, opening up a discovery, then maybe knight comes to d6, and you know, who knows what might happen. So queen captures on e5, Maxime grabs yet another pawn to get the queen out of the d file. And now the position has been reached before. Moves like bishop to g3 are known moves, going after the queen. Bishop to e2 is a known move. But here we have c3 by Fabi, just adding a defender here. And it is only now as of move 16 that we have a completely new game. So let's see how Maxime deals with this. Maxime starts by developing. He plays bishop to c5. And he says, all right, maybe in such an open game, usually you don't want to trade the bishop pair, but here he is already up material, so he really doesn't mind something like, and it's not even possible here because the queen on e3 is undefended. So bishop to c5 definitely makes sense. With bishop to g3, pushing Maxime's queen back, and now queen to d5 has to go here, because if you try something like an in-between Zwischenzug with something like bishop captures on d4, then you get rook captures, and now you're in a lot of trouble, because after the queen moves, just knight to d6 check, and either you're losing the bishop here, or if the king defends it, knight f7 check picks up the rook, so you're losing something. So instead, after bishop to g3, we have queen back to d5. Again, the only good move for Maxime, even though it aligns right with the rook, but it doesn't matter. And here Maxime is asking, all right, what's your compensation here? Do you even have a plan here? I mean, it's not like you have a move. You can't really move the knight. The queen falls. None of your other pieces are doing all that much. If I castle, that's it. You don't really have an attack here. And here Fabi plays the move, such a wild move. The move from the thumbnail. And that is bishop to c4, and this is just wonderful stuff. Such wonderful preparation, and Fabi played Fabi played all of his moves instantly up until this point, and even further, as you'll see. So here the question is, what do you do? Do you accept this very nice gift, or do you move the queen? Problem is, if you move the queen, then you run into ideas like bishop to d6, and you are worse for the rest of the game. Not just worse, you are lost. The king is never leaving here. There's already a lot of pressure on this bishop here, and you really can't even find a move that is playable here. So you have to watch out for ideas like this. So instead, after bishop to c4, Maxime says, all right, let's see what you got. Queen captures on c4, and now comes bishop to d6, and this is Fabi's idea. And as you'll see, it's quite a tricky one. The problem is, of course, you cannot capture the bishop, just knight captures with check, and of course you win the queen. Another thing, if you try, what else can you try? If you just continue development, knight to c6 runs into bishop captures on c5. And now again, what do you play? If knight captures, then again you've released the d6 square, and now the knight can deliver this very nice fork, a royal fork if you will, and again white wins. And another thing you might consider, okay, let's just go back with the bishop so we don't run into anything, and if any, bishop captures on b8, trying to move the light square bishop with tempo, trying to free up the d6 square for the white knight. Then it doesn't work, because now our bishop guards this square. The problem is, if you go bishop to a7, then we can just move to b4 and still prevent black from castling. Black will not lose all that much material here, but it will be very difficult to play. And black can even go for some very tricky queen captures on b4 ideas here. For example, c captures and castles, and I don't know. Seems like an idea that Maxime even might go for, but maybe not for a game that's being played in the candidates tournament, one that is to decide the challenger to the world champion. So instead, after bishop to d6, Maxime goes for knight to f6. He has to give back material, and Fabi gladly accepts. Here we have knight captures on c5, and now comes Maxime's idea. Knight to d5, attacking Fabi's queen on e3, queen to e5 now, putting pressure on g7, and look at this pile up here. This is just incredible. I mean, it's hard to imagine that you would willingly go into this with the black pieces, but this is what Maxime does. This is what he always does. Sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't, but he always goes for it, and you can be sure about that. Something that also was very much characteristic of Bobby Fischer. You always knew what Bobby Fischer would play. You always knew the exact line that he was going to play. Most of the times, even the exact move order, but you were just helpless against it. So here, defending the g7 pawn with rook to g8, and now comes Fabi's idea. It's time to start sacrificing something. So here he comes. Knight d captures on e6. And this has to be accepted, otherwise this knight will just wreak havoc here. So here, f captures on e6, and now the other knight captures as well. Knight captures on e6. And now you can't really capture further, because if this then captures with check, and if king d8, then you can either pick up the rook, or you can even play rook captures on d5, and now you really don't have any counterplay here. Any checks will very quickly be met with, you will very quickly get out of checks. You can block with the rook, and then it's just, you're getting checkmated very quickly. So instead, after knight captures on e6, we have the only move available to black that's, that's actually good. You could try to gamble it with ideas like knight to f6, but I mean, who does this? So instead, queen captures on c3 with check. Here he forces a queen trade. Queen captures on c3, knight captures, and now finally Fabi finishes it off with knight to c7 check, and this is now winning the rook. So king to f7, getting out of the way, and now comes rook to d3. Of course, white's rook is also under attack, so rook to d3. And here Maxime has a choice, and he has to play something. And now his rook is hanging, and he could play rook to a7. And rook to a7 seems like a reasonable thing to do. You play rook a7, you give up the knight on c3, and then we just go, let's say, king g6, king to h7. For example, white will castle. That's why we move the king h7, and now you could, let's say, go bishop c5, attack the rook, and then let's say you either give up the rook, which makes no sense, or you have to start giving back pawns, b6, bishop captures on b6, and so on. Maybe you play rook to b7 and try and continue playing this game with your position being a bit more passive. You are up a pawn, but your position is a bit more passive. However, Maxime never takes the easy way out. After this rook to d3, Maxime doesn't defend his rook with rook to a7. Rather, Maxime just plays knight to e4. And this is the first move where Fabi actually started thinking. The situation on the clock is 1 hour and 43 minutes for Fabi, and only 32 minutes for Maxime. And that's really insane. So up until this point, it's been pure preparation from Fabi's side, and we're only on move 26, so we still need to make 14 more moves to reach time control, so Maxime can get a little bit more time. And here, while you could grab the rook right away, for example, knight captures on a8, then we run into knight captures on d6, rook captures on d6, and now something like king to e7, not allowing this rook to remain here. Also, you don't want to face castles with check. And now, if we see something like rook g6, we might even see a repetition of moves here. King e7, rook g6, and so on. Rook g6 with the idea of this rook being, unable to get into the game because the g7 pawn would be hanging. So instead, after this knight to e4, Fabi first goes for castles. Of course, this comes with check. We have king to g6. You could also block with the knight. Maxime prefers to keep his knight active on e4. So king to g6, and only now Fabi grabs the rook. We have knight captures on a8, and now comes knight to c6. Here, Maxime missed a bit of a more precise rook to d8. Simply because there's a lot of pressure here on the bishop. And then after rook f to d1, then you go knight to c6. This is the correct move order for you to do things. But he played knight to c6 right away, and this allowed Fabi to put a lot of problems his way. So here Fabi goes knight to b6, now puts pressure on this bishop, and here you should probably play something like bishop to f5, but Maxime continued with rook to d8 like it was the same line, and now he allows Fabi this knight captures on c8. And okay, knight captures, we have rook captures, and now bishop back to a3. Another very interesting idea is rook to e1, just putting pressure on this knight, and now the knight has to go somewhere, probably to g5, and white retains a very active position. Problem is, if you go after the bishop, then captures with check, king h7, and now rook to d7. This is now obviously very strong. The b7 pawn is under attack. If you go for this, then rook c7. And pretty much black's position is paralyzed. You can't move the pawn because the knight hangs. If you move the knight, then you allow doubling of the rooks here. So it would be, probably a winning position. For example, if a5, you start pushing this pawn, just rook e3, and that pawn is not going very far. But okay, instead, like we said, after rook captures on c8 with bishop to a3 by Fabi, he wants to shift the bishop over to b2 to then add more pressure to the g7 pawn. And now comes rook to c7. Now Maxime takes care of the 7th rank, so he will not allow any rook lifting. We have rook to f4 going after the knight, and now knight back to f6. And here, again, the situation on the clock is not great for Maxime, but he's doing okay, and we're already on move 32. So some 55 minutes for Fabi and 17 minutes for Maxime. So bishop to b2, now just shifting the bishop to this long diagonal, and now comes knight to e7. Problem is, you don't really have the option of starting to push your passed pawn. And it's very hard to do this at any point before you actually make proper preparations, because here, for example, just bishop captures, g captures, and rook to d6, now putting pressure on the pawn, and there's very little you can do. There's really nothing you can do to defend against this. So instead, after bishop to b2, we have knight to e7, and now comes, well, what Fabi had in mind. It doesn't seem very intuitive, or rather even seems counterintuitive to give up this beautiful bishop, but if it works, you have to play it. So bishop captures, we have g captures, and now h4. And now comes another very interesting moment in the game. Here again, if Maxime starts pushing, let's say b5, then you again allow some rook to d6 action, attacking this pawn, and if knight f5 blocking this rook, then we could have something like captures, and then what are you going to play here? There's really not all that much you can do. So not really something to go for. So instead, Maxime plays the much better h5, and this is really great because in the future, if for example rook comes to claim the 5th rank and you get this pawn to for example h5 with check, then the king will have to go back. With this h5 move, Maxime makes sure that such a thing never happens. But okay, now Fabi needs to find a different idea, and he might make this h5 pawn a target. So rook to g3 with check, king to f7, and now comes rook to g5. As the f pawn is pinned, makes sense. He will now win the h5 pawn, but of course Maxime has something to say about that. Rook to c1 with check, king h2, and now knight to g6, attacking this rook and this pawn. And of course you can't keep defending this pawn, because if the rook moves anywhere away from the f-file, then of course we can just capture this rook on g5. So instead, rook f2, you have to keep the pin, and now comes knight captures on h4, rook captures on h5, and now just knight back to g6. You could decide maybe to defend the knight with rook to c4, but it's pretty much the same. Just g3, knight goes back, rook h7 check, and now the king will have to move, and after the king moves, we're gonna capture this pawn on b7. So it's pretty much the same. You don't really get anything by defending it. So we have knight to g6 right away, and only now rook to h7 with check, king to e6, and now rook captures on b7. So you can see for the past 20 moves, this past a and b pawn were never really got to their moment. They could never be pushed. So here, knight to e5, and now comes rook to b6 with check, preparing to win the other pawn as well. And here, Fabi went into, or rather, Maxime went into a really long think, and he had to decide what to do here. But also, not that long of a think. Fabi had a much longer think for this rook to b6 move. It was, I think, the first really long think of the game. It was over 20 minutes, and he had to calculate precisely. So of course, rook to c6, he's blocking this, and now rook captures. You could also play something like rook to b2, and then just keep the pressure with the idea of captures, and then this rook coming to b6. But after king d6, it doesn't really work, so you'd have to, again, look for something else. If captures, you don't have rook to b6. So instead, after rook to c6, Fabi just captures, we have captures, and then now comes king to g3. We have king to f7, and now comes rook to c2. Now the knight will have to move. We're going to attack it again, and then we're going to go after the a6 pawn. So here, knight to b4, attacking the rook here, and now, of course, rook to d2. So what do you play here? Knight to c6, and now we play king to f4. And it's very interesting. It's you definitely have winning chances with white here, as long as the pawn is on g2, as something Magnus said, as he's also one of the commentators in Chess24 live streaming. But if this pawn was, for example, on g4, then it would be bad, because you could at some point sacrifice your knight for this pawn, which is not something that you want to allow, or rather not sacrifice it. You would force either the white rook or the white king to stay back and help out with defending of the pawn. So king to f4, and now comes king to g6. We have rook to d6, finally attacking this knight, knight to e5, and now we finally eliminated the pawn. We have rook captures on a6, and now rook to f7, and now black needs to defend this constantly, and he can't allow white to enter the position. For example, if this king touches f5, then it's gonna be very scary. One idea is something like rook a3 to g3, and then you push back the king, but that's why the knight is very nicely placed here, because you can always block with something like knight to g5. So here we have king to e4, and now knight to h6. So what do you play here? Instead of knight to h6, which might not be all that great, knight to e5 was also a possibility, but again, it's very hard to say. For example, rook to a8, knight back to f7, we're gonna go rook to g8 with check, king h7, and now rook to g4. And now what do you play here? Knight d6 check, king d5, and now we enter the position, and we win the game. So you have to be extremely precise here, and if this is a win, then this is a table-based win, and if it's a draw, it's a table-based draw. So very, very difficult stuff. So after king to e4, we have knight to h6 by Maxime, and now comes rook to a5. So knight back to f7, and now rook to a3. We have knight to d6 with check, king f4, and now knight to f5. Very important, guarding the g3 square, so no rook to g3 check is possible. We have rook to d3, a nice waiting move, and now again Maxime repeats with knight to h6, and this is not good. He should have gone for knight to g7. This is the correct square, and then from there you will be able to defend. But now knight to h6, he allows rook to g3 check for Fabi, king to f7, and now comes king to e4. And this is very strong. Moving the rook and then trying to harass the black king from this side might be a little bit easier, but who knows? I don't think. I think Maxime had to believe that this is a table-based draw, and Fabi had to believe that this is a table-based win. Even though by the sheer amount of moves that was played in this game, I don't think that was the case. But okay, king to e4, and now comes knight to g8. Just trying to stay in the game. Problem is, if you play something like king to f8, then rook to g6 is very strong, attacking both knight and the pawn. And if something like knight to g8, then king f5, and then again you've allowed the white king to claim the f5 square. So instead, after king to e4, knight to g8 by Maxime, and now comes king to f5 finally. Again, it's it's a very tricky position. Probably something like rook to a3 is a bit more straightforward, but again, it's very hard to even decipher why. I will show one line that's really good for white. For example, knight e7, we're gonna pin the knight, rook a7, and now if king a6, now we're gonna go king f3, and now basically we need to touch the h5 square, and then everything is going our way. King f7, we're gonna go rook g4, now it doesn't really matter. King e6, king h5, king f7, and now king h6. We're gonna go king e6, g4 now, taking away the f5 square, and now it doesn't really matter. Or rather, if instead of this we go something like king to g7, then knight to f5 check, and then we have to go back. We haven't really achieved anything. So g4 is much better, and then after king to f7, now we play king to h7, king to e6, and now king to g7. And now after a move like knight to d5, we're gonna play rook to a6 check, king to e7, and now rook to a5. We kick away the defender of the f6 pawn, and finally after the knight moves, now two more checks, rook a7 check, king e6, rook a6 check, and the f6 pawn finally falls. King e5, rook captures here, and that's it. Now the game is winning. but it really takes a lot to win this pawn. But instead of this, instead of rook to a3 or something like that, we have king to f5 immediately, and this is a bit more difficult. Maxime goes knight to e7 check, king f4, and now knight to d5 check, and now comes king to g4. King to f5, again, you should probably try king f5 back, and then if king e7 check, then king to e4, and then go for this exact same idea, because now it's going to be much more difficult. So after knight d5 check, we have king to g4, and king to g6 now, not allowing, of course, the white king to touch h5 or f5. So king f3 check, king back to f7, and now king to e4. Fabi will try again, of course. And here we have knight to e7, and this seems to be one of the only one of the mistakes in the game where, you know, it's very hard to even claim that a move is a mistake, but you know, such are the games where we can't really learn. I mean, if these guys don't know what this is and how this is played precisely, then I don't know who does. But here, for example, knight to c7 ensures a table-based draw. However, knight to e7, the move Maxime thought does, as probably he thought that this was enough, does not ensure a draw. So here, king f4 by Fabi, knight to d5 check, king to f5, we have knight to e7 check, king back to e4, and now knight to g8 by Maxime. We have rook to h3 by Fabi, king to g6, and now finally rook back to a3, king to f7, and now king to f4. We have knight to h6, and now rook to g3. We have knight back to g8, now comes king to g4, and now we are definitely claiming this h5 square. The problem is, if king to g6 now, then king h4 check, and you have to take care of the knight. You have to go back, and then we win the h5 square. And we know that if our king touches h5, then it's a winning endgame. So instead, after king to g4, we have knight to e7, and now comes king to h5. We have knight to d5 now, hoping for some knight f4 check ideas, but now rook to f3. Fabi just eliminates all of these ideas with king to e6, and now g4. And g4 was very, very impressive by Fabi, because if it doesn't work, then you're just throwing the game away. But he shows that he can calculate very, very precisely, even after playing for like 5.5 hours, and he finds the correct idea. So here, point is, if you go back, let's say king f7, just king h6. If knight e7, we just go g5. Remember, the f pawn is pinned, and if we again, let's say, go here to defend this, we just advance g6 check, king g8, now rook d3, and that's it. We cannot move the knight because all of these squares are covered. If the knight moves, this is just going to be checkmate. So instead, after g4, we have king to e5, but now Fabi just plays king to g6, and it was in this position on move 74 that Maxime Vachier Lagrave resigned the game, and that means Fabiano Caruana catches up to Maxime Vachier Lagrave. And if you remember the standings from the first part of the tournament, Fabi had 3.5 points, Maxime had 4.5. He was sharing first place with Yanni Pomnici. Now Fabi also has 4.5 points, and he definitely is catching up to the leaders. We're going to show at least one more game to see where the standings are headed. So we're not going to discuss the standings of our round 8 just yet, but we're going to do it at the end of all the games that are shown. So really, really impressive stuff by Fabi. Very, very excruciating endgame, but the opening and the middle game were you know, like watching a movie. I mean, after this, after this idea that Fabi found, you know, just c3, first a new move, and then already he shows what the idea was. c3, bishop c5, and then bishop c4. Amazing stuff, and this is what it takes to take down Maxime when Maxime goes for the Sicilian defense. You can't just play anything. Maxime knows everything, and even here where Fabi caught him off guard, Maxime I mean, he defended everything. It took him a lot of time, but he found all of the correct ideas and all of the right moves, and it's very... I did not think that he would lose this, but Fabi is a machine. Fabi is the second highest rated chess player in the world, and if you give him, you know, a little bit of hope, he will, you know, bite down onto that, and he will see it through. But it was an incredibly exciting game, and really awesome. One moment where I think maybe it could have gone differently was here when Maxime decided to go for this knight to e4 idea, where he didn't just try and hold on to everything with rook to a7. Maybe it would be. I don't think Fabi would go for the draw, like we mentioned. I think Fabi would probably continue playing, but who knows? Maybe he thought, okay, this is a bit too passive. Now the rook is here. None of my pieces are developed. Maybe it is a bit too dangerous. And I'm sure he made the correct, the practical idea. But who knows? Maybe he even thought that the rook sacrifice here was the exchange sacrifice here was the way to go, and then he can just start pushing his pawns. But as you've seen, those pawns never really had a chance. So yeah, after this really wild game, after move 74, he resigned, as there is nothing more to be done here. Problem is, if you go for something like knight f4 check, let's say king h6, you're gonna go king e4, attack the rook, rook f1, doesn't really matter. King to e5, we're just gonna go king g7. The pawn is now, well, being very much threatened. If knight here with check, we can go king f7. And that's it. Once we block with knight f4, we're just going to play rook to e1 check. You can't go here, you can't go here, you have to move back. King d6, we win the pawn. And now that we've won the pawn, it's just a very easy win. So really amazing stuff, and definitely a great turn of events for Fabi, as he now has well, great chances of winning the candidates tournament and challenging Magnus for the title second time in a row. So we'll see what happens. Stay tuned, and sorry about a very long video, but this was a very long game. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to thank Onforio Martino, Tomasz Janowicz, Philip Gleason, David Kimura, and the Mr. Hoodie Guy for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the candidates tournament, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.